The following episode of Backstory Podcast was recorded live at the 26th Annual Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival. You can listen to this episode and you can watch it on our YouTube channel.
Hello and welcome to Backstory, the podcast from Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival. My name is Vidhya Elango. I'm the programming coordinator here at Real Asian. So in a few hours, we'll be playing the Canadian premiere of the film Big Fight in Little Chinatown by Karen Cho. So Big Fight looks at 5 Chinatowns in North America: New York City, Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto, and San Francisco, shining a light on the twin legacies of displacement and resistance that characterize these neighborhoods. The film also focuses more deeply on current organizing efforts against development pressures in New York City and Montreal's Chinatowns, allowing viewers to both reflect on how we got here and how we can build community power to move forward. So before the big screening this afternoon, we're lucky enough to be joined live by Karen Cho, the director of the film, as well as Alexandra Hong, who is part of a grassroots community organization called Friends of Chinatown, Toronto, as well as the Toronto Chinatown Land Trust. We're so happy to have you both here today, and welcome to Real Asian.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
For sure. And I guess just to get started, Karen, I was wondering if you could briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about what drew you to this topic of Chinatowns and neighborhood change, gentrification, and why you wanted to make this film.
Oh, well, hi, I'm Karen Cho. I'm the director of the film. It's kind of a long story in a way, like what drew me to this subject matter, because about 20 years ago now, the very, very first film I made was a film on the Chinese Head Tax and Exclusion Act. Mm-hmm. There's a film called In the Shadow of Gold Mountain. And that film actually, when I finished it, it premiered and it screened in Chinatowns across Canada. So I had connections with the communities in various Chinatowns in Canada. And my own family histories go very deep into the history of both Montreal and Vancouver's Chinatowns. So, fast forward almost 20 years, I could see how some of these places that I knew quite well, were kind of entering periods of neglect, decline, and some of them, complete erasure almost. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of from there that I wanted to look into the kind of gentrification pressures, around Chinatowns, things they were facing, but also this kind of more existential question in a way of, this is really the place that the Chinese diaspora wrote their story, Chinatown. So what happens to us in a way when these places disappear? Mm-hmm. So I kind of wanted to look at it from that angle. But then, of course, I was in New York City at the Coast to Coast Chinatown gathering against displacement, and there was actually some members from FOC there. That's how I met so many different Chinatowns. And of course, I was in New York City. We were there 3 days before they shut down New York, for COVID.
Right.
And everywhere else subsequently. But because I was on the ground in that New York, I was able to make all these connections. And then, of course, the COVID story kind of, the film was going to be kind of a film on gentrification and these pressures on these kind of neighborhoods. But COVID added this extra layer where all the anti-Asian racism bubbled back up to the surface. And there was this real parallel between, the history of the founding of a lot of these Chinatowns and the pressures that they're going through in the present day.
Yeah, for sure. And even the history of people thinking Chinatowns are these hotbeds of disease, and then just continuing to think that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the stigmatization and all. Yeah, completely.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, yeah, thank you for that. And I guess I'll turn it over to Alex. So I was just wondering if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about Friends of Chinatown, also known as FOCT, as well as the Land Trust and the work that you're all doing there. And if you could also maybe share what your response was to seeing Karen's film.
Sure, yeah. So my name is Alex, and I'm one of the many organizers with Friends of Chinatown. We are a group of people that are fighting for economic, racial, and social justice within Toronto's Chinatown. We do that through, we've done that through a variety of ways. I think mentioning the idea of COVID, in Toronto, Chinatown was one of the lowest vaccinated places, neighborhoods in the city, and we organized a series of vax clinics to essentially vaccinate our neighborhood. And then in doing that, we realized that there was so much systemic racism in healthcare because, even the act of having these clinics prioritized in these neighborhoods was such an afterthought. You know, other neighborhoods were already at 80% when Chinatown was at 20. The efforts in providing translation was extremely poor, and we called out, like, you know, quite a lot of folks who were organizing this, and really just recognizing that there's so much to be done in our neighborhoods. We also do other work around, you know, supporting tenants and workers, migrant workers, sex workers within Chinatown, really focusing on those who are the most vulnerable and who actually need Chinatown to survive. The land trust is coming out of this work. We realized that, like, you know, with the threat of land assemblies, which, you know, we saw in Karen's film as starting to happen, you know, threat of evictions or lack of affordable housing being a huge issue, that we needed to look at alternatives to support, you know, the Chinatown tenants. And so the land trust kind of came out of that. We are very new, but the idea of a land trust is to take property off the speculative real estate market. So what that means is that it's no longer going to be part of the game of selling and buying and making profit, and putting it back in the hands of community, so that they can make decisions around, you know, how it's being used, you know, and the just really controlling the affordability of it through community control. And then switching to, I guess, like the response to Karen's film, I think it was really lovely to see, I think, that narrative come together across North America, because I think for me, like, it was only when I was an adult that I learned about, you know, Chinese head tax, and that we're even on, like, next year is the 100th year of, like, you know, just even some of the, like, legislations and, like, the impacts are being felt still today. And I don't think that's a story that's told or hasn't been told it's not in the public discourse. And I do think being able to connect those threads was really lovely, and to see, like, here are the voices of people who are in Chinatowns, and these are the things that they're doing, and that their existence and their stories have existed since, you know, Canada's foundation. And we need to be able to unpack that together and to move on from that to build, you know, a better place for all of us. So congratulations.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, like, comparative aspect of the film is just, like, so beautiful, and, like, really, maybe, you know, like, you know, maybe people know a little bit about, like, Toronto's Chinatown if they're from here, but, like, really, like, historicizing that perspective was, I think, just one of, like, the really great strengths of the film. Like, I don't know, we learn about, like even though, like, there's so many different contexts, like, a lot of the same things happened, like, you know, the, like, urban renewal, like, affected both Toronto's Chinatown and Vancouver's Chinatown, and all of them. And I think, like, in a lot of ways, like, current development pressures, like, really echo what we heard in the past. Like, I think there's someone in the film who was like, oh, we don't need Chinatowns, or, like, they said they were talking to a developer who was saying, like, we don't need Chinatowns anymore, which was kind of the logic behind, like, urban renewals, like, 50 years ago. So yeah, I guess I was just wondering, like, how do you think the histories of Chinatowns, like, both
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Like, I think that was really important to me in the film, because I didn't want to make a film, and people have made films about, like, Chinatown dying, right? Like this idea of gentrification being this inevitable force that's just a kind of natural thing. And it was actually May Lum, who's one of the subjects in New York's Chinatown. I was sitting the very first time I met with her in her kitchen, asking her questions about the gentrification of the neighborhood and displacement. And she says, you have to understand, gentrification is not a natural phenomena. It's based off of a series of priorities and goals that a city sets out, and choices that a city makes. So this really kind of got me thinking about things. And then I'd seen historically, like, when you kind of looked at, because in 2019 I went to this kind of like Chinatown leadership conference, or Chinese leadership conference, and there was a round table on Chinatowns, and a bunch of Chinatowns in Canada just started talking about, like, what was happening in their neighborhoods or what had happened. And I mean, maybe it was new to me anyways, like, other people might know this, but I was like, oh my God, there's literally a pattern of the government coming in, dumping highways and buildings and whatever they want onto every Chinatown. And then, of course, this exacerbates the land value, and the the private developers come in after that. So I wanted to kind of explore those issues, but also tell a story like that really focused on the advocacy and the agency of the community themselves. You know, like Jean Lum is in the archives. Like the grandmother of Save Chinatown is like from Toronto, right? And but also it's like those seeds of resistance and the 200-year history in some of these Chinatowns. It's the staying power of the community. You know, it's like that piece of grass in the cement that just, it won't die. Like it just grows despite all the hostility around it. And it's because there's elements of Chinatown that really take us into an urban future, right? Like, I mean, if you think about, like, if you're an urban developer, you know, Chinatown is like this quintessential Jane Jacobs neighborhood, you know, with a racial lens on top of it. It's inclusive, walkable, sustainable. There's a human scale to it. It's literally like an urban planner's dream of a neighborhood, right? So the ingredients of how you make an inclusive, amazing future neighborhood are all there in Chinatown. And instead of maybe fostering the like let's bulldoze everything concept of how you build a city, if we actually take time to care for those things in Chinatown that work really well and are the kind of things we want to maintain, if we actually foster those and grow those, could Chinatown not be a blueprint for the future of city planning? You know, so that was something I really wanted to put into the film, like this idea of this historical place is actually a key to the future.
Yeah.
Like, I think the idea too around like how cities and politicians, we like to exploit Chinatown for its cultural like value, right? Like it's like, look how diverse the city is. There's a place like Chinatown, and look at the food, look at the amazing food. So it's so easy to reduce Chinatown to these like aesthetic and cultural components, and then when push comes to shove, it's like the people don't matter. They can leave. They can go somewhere else. Like we can, you know, we can build like condos that are like $2,000 for a studio. And it's like, well, the reason why Chinatown is so rich and is so vibrant is because of the people. Like, let's not forget the actual people that are living here, working here, need it. And like, let's actually protect them and allow them to stay. Like, I think even within Chinatown, like, there are a lot of tensions. Like, we're not a monolith. Like, you still have bad landlords. You still have bad business owners who are exploiting their workers. Like, there's so much we can do to protect our neighborhoods and to protect our people. And like, we really need to look at the most vulnerable and not forget why Chinatown, why they even exist, right? Like, we existed because the government didn't want us to be here. We existed because they didn't want us to integrate with the rest of the like the country. And, you know, if we look at the idea of like family associations and where they came from, it is like mutual aid at its like core, at its heart, right? People who share the last names coming together and saying like, we'll help each other. This world is, I don't know, can I swear? I was gonna swear.
I don't care.
This world is fucked. But this world is like, it's not fair and it's very unjust. And like, we need to band together. So I think that like in all of the future organizing we do, we need to not forget our roots and our histories, and like we, you know, our people who hold these wisdoms, like, you know, like we can look to like Jean Lum, Arlene Chan, like folks who have been here, who have done so much to, you know, further the story and make sure our stories are told. And then what do we do for that? Like how can we like continue doing that work?
Yeah, for sure. Something that like I thought was really interesting about the film was like, so like Montreal won like that was like a big feature of the film, that Montreal was working on getting heritage status for like, you know, those few buildings in Chinatown. And it was like they were talking about how heritage is both tangible and intangible. And like, I guess I was just thinking like, it's maybe like a little bit easier to preserve like a specific building's facade. Like, not that that's actually easy, like it obviously took a lot of work, but like preserving those relationships that like make Chinatown what it is, and like historically they've been nurtured by things like family associations, like you just said. But yeah, I was just like wondering how you guys think that we can continue to nurture those relationships and care for one another in the future. Like, is it through family associations? Is it like other mechanisms? And yeah, just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the heritage status thing in Montreal is interesting because I also work with the Chinatown working group. So I mean, I documented it and I was very involved in that, but for us, it was really a strategy in our Chinatown, and it's something that works for our Chinatown because our Chinatown, unlike Toronto's Chinatown, wasn't displaced. We're actually in our original geographic footprint, so we do have these buildings that date back to the beginnings of Montreal, like 1826, like really old buildings. So, but for us, there was so much land speculation happening in Montreal's Chinatown, and no protections. Like you could build up to 20 stories, and most of the Chinatown buildings are like 3 to 5 stories. So this developer came in, bought the Wings Noodle Factory, which is my great grandfather was a partner in that company that became there, and they've been operating out of Chinatown for 100 years, right? So those buildings were bought up, and then they started assembling land on all the most historic block. And for us, it was really like a step one, a kind of way of cooling down the real estate market, because it was speculating at this crazy level. But in and of itself, like, heritage status does nothing in the sense of it protects the facade, right? So you could easily mothball your Chinatown by doing that. Like, if you put all these restrictions on, it's like you put a glass dome over the thing and then it can't grow and live. And we have to remember Chinatown's not a museum, right? It's a living community and it needs to be able to evolve and thrive and grow and do all of those things. So back to the question of, like, bringing back community and connections in the places. You also need a building to be able, you need a footprint, you need a geographical place for that to take place. So what we're interested in, I think, like in our Chinatown, is really kind of reactivating, in a way, some of these historical spaces, family associations, but bringing in, like in Vancouver, they do such, the Wongs in Vancouver, it's in the film, but they've been bringing in younger generations into the Wong Family Association, because these are community owned buildings. They're kind of like land trusts. If you think about, like, each, it's like not just one guy owns the building. Everybody put money in to buy that building. It's collectively owned. And if you start bringing back younger generations, doing programming out of the thing, it starts to have a meaning beyond. I mean, it has a meaning already, but you continue this meaning and this connection. And it's really the community and the connections to the spaces that start to revitalize the space. And then the buildings can, you can do adaptive reuse. I'm not like, it's just because it has this fancy cornice, we need to keep it like that forever. I'm more interested in what's in the building, because there's these other Chinatowns, like you're saying, how the city uses as a prop. Like Washington, D.C.'s Chinatown is like a classic example of, they pass all these laws. You need to have like Chinese signage and all these, fancy pagoda-esque looking like things. But so they have that in that Chinatown, but inside is a Hooters, and a McDonald's. And I'm not like joking, like it's literally that. And the entire community is being emptied out. So it becomes this, like a Disney-fied kind of empty shell where everyone just goes home at 5 o'clock when all the tourist shops close. So that's the thing you don't want at all. And heritage status can do something like that if you don't foster the intangible cultural heritage inside those buildings, which is basically the people and the community and the cultural production.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, I totally agree with you. It's like we use whatever strategies we can, but recognize that they have their limitations, right? Like, even I think in Toronto it's interesting because, like, if we look at which neighborhoods have heritage designation, it's like Yorkville, Rosedale, Queen West. Like, those are neighborhoods that are not supporting working people or like low income people or people who don't speak English. They're like the richest neighborhoods in the city, like, I think that, like, it can happen because we forget about the people. We forget about the actual, like, it's so easy to write it in policy and say, like, yeah, I must have all this Asian signage, and like it must look, have certain looks or certain features like on the facade. So I think the idea of, like, what do you need to do to foster relationships is, like, thinking about who are the people within Chinatown, what's the unique situation. And I think the Chinatowns are different, like, and the strategies that we use to fight is different, right? Like, that we'll need to use to fight is different because it's so contextual, like. And I think the question then is, like, how do we respond to the folks who are in these Chinatowns, who are the most vulnerable, who are, like, who need our collective support and collective, like, organizing efforts, and then we do the work from that. So it's like, I think for us in Toronto right now, the land trust is coming out because we're recognizing that like land assemblies are happening, there's the risk of that, it's not affordable to live here, and we're choosing to use this as one strategy. Is it our only strategy? No, there's so many limitations of that. Like even internally as the land trust, we're thinking about like, okay, like can we, like what is it, are we just going to become landlords? Like we don't want to necessarily be perpetuating the harm that, you know, some landlords are doing. We don't want to necessarily be having to manage like property in this way. And then also we're thinking back to like, what does that mean to be on Indigenous territory? Like how can you have land back with a land trust? And that's a very complicated question that we are hoping to continually unpack, and to know that like, you know, the land trust shouldn't exist. Like Chi just did a really love, one of the organizers of FOCT, who's also involved in land trust work, said something at a talk about land trust being like, this shouldn't exist. Like land trusts are a strategy that we're forced to use because there's no other strategy right now, and this is the best option. But like in an ideal world, like people can just live without having to struggle. They should be able to have food, access to food, you know, be paid well, have a living wage, not be exploited. And like that's our end goal, you know, and along the way we're going to try a bunch of different things.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think you were also kind of speaking to like so in the film, the word steward comes up a lot, because I think a lot of the people that, Karen, you were interviewing are stewards of Chinatowns, or like trying to steer Chinatowns into the future. And I guess like the Land Trust and FOCT are kind of doing the same things. And I guess what you just spoke to is like kind of the difficulty and like kind of complicatedness of trying to like steer Chinatowns forward, and how to do that, I guess, in a collective way.
Like I guess there's no perfect answer, and there's no way we're ever going to do it 100% right. And I think it's like we have to be okay that we'll make some mistakes along the way, and that we're going to reflect back and be like, oh, like that was not the best strategy or the best, like, you know, approach potentially. I do think like what we try to do is look back to our values. Like, you know, we have a values document that we refer to, and it becomes kind of like our guiding light for the work we do, the work that we choose to do, and the projects that we kind of take on. Like, interestingly enough, like I think that when I read the word stewards, I was kind of like, I don't feel comfortable being a steward. Like that for me feels like, I don't know why, it just feels like very like directorial, or like somehow there's like a group that gets to dictate what's happening. And I think we constantly in FOCT constantly joke that we're just a random group of people. Like, you know, like what we're coming together because we care, and we care for a certain reason. But like, who are we to say like what should actually happen? Like yes, of course we should have some say because we belong here as well. And we, you know, the Chinatown is for us too. And, you know, we have a relationship to Chinatown. But there are so many other voices that are outside of FOCT that we need to bring in, that we need to constantly be thinking about and, you know, reflecting on. And so I think like why we do the work and how we do the work is really going to be dependent on our ability to build these relationships with the people that are there. And then I think for us, we're thinking about like, okay, who are the most vulnerable and how can we support them?
Yeah, for sure. And I think like even you were just talking about like a little bit before about how, yeah, Chinatowns are not a monolith. Like there's a lot of tensions, like you're talking about like landlords and like business owners. And that's something I was really curious about, like both in the film and like your organizing work. Like obviously there's like variances and like diversity to a community, and like, you know, you talk to like people who are business owners and landlords in Chinatown, but like as well as community groups. So I was just, I guess, you know, wondering how you balance these different perspectives in a film like this, because, you know, obviously, like I think Jan, who is one of the subjects in the New York City Chinatown, he obviously cares a lot and does a lot of like organizing work, but he is like, you know, still a landlord, and he made the point of like, you know, in our communities landlords look like us, but he still has, you know, more power maybe than, you know, someone who's just like renting the space. So yeah, just wondering about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the film, so I did try to get different perspectives because it's like an ecosystem, Chinatown, you know, there's different people that are part of that different ecosystem. So I wanted to kind of get a cross section as much as I could of all those different things. but also have a kind of really zoomed in perspective. So like you're on the ground, and to me, like some of the stewards of Chinatown, it is like the person running the legacy business, the landlord guy, the restaurant owner, like all these people and the community organizers are stewards for the Chinatown. So I wanted to be really on the ground, like literally like in the back kitchen and in the little family owned store, but then kind of zoom out and it's like, how does their part in this little, or how are they affected by this overarching, you know, gentrification, urban planning, racism, like that's happening in all the Chinatowns, kind of play into that. But you know, to the point with Jen being a landlord, and what you were saying, Alex, about this value kind of system that you have around, I think it comes down to the values around Chinatown, right? Like yes, Jan Lee's a landlord, but he's also the kind of landlord that during COVID, when his commercial business Hop Key, the restaurant that's in the basement there, when they literally couldn't pay their rent at all because they're shut down and shunned and all these things, Jan had that relationship with them and that trust with them. He's like, okay, like pay me when you can, right? And not every landlord did that. Like the Jin Fong workers in New York City, Jin Fong was like this huge banquet dim sum restaurant that got shut down, also owned by landlords, big landlords in Chinatown that didn't care. They couldn't pay their rent. They're just out, right?
Yeah.
So there, it's the value system, because I realized that in a lot of the Chinatowns, what keeps them in lock and what keeps them protected is the small landlords, ironically. So the you know, like the family associations own the building. They're keeping the building. It's staying there. If there are small landlords, and I'm not like defending landlords that are like pushing out their tenants or, you know, but small landlords that are committed to the neighborhood and the people, like in our Montreal's Chinatown, same thing. There was a restaurant ready, you know, almost going bankrupt because of COVID, ready to leave the neighborhood, and they were in the Chan Family Association. So the Chans were like, no, like we need you, we want you, this is important. We're gonna give you a deal for your renewal of your lease, you know, because you're part of Chinatown. So it's those values, but also the value of like the value system around Chinatown being this place of sanctuary, right? It was a place, it was the only place we could live, like in this crazy time where there was all this racism. We had mutual aid societies because we couldn't have healthcare. We weren't allowed to opening bank accounts. We couldn't own land. We couldn't work in certain professions. So Chinatown became this kind of self-sustaining enclave because we, through the community, supported each other. So it's like that value needs to be continued, and it doesn't have to be continued just for Chinese people or just for Asian people. You know, like arguably the most Chinatown thing about Vancouver's Chinatown is this like little restaurant that popped up by Yemeni new immigrants, you know, from Yemen. And of course, like they're not Chinese, but it's like, but their business is so Chinatown in the sense that it's like it's a stepping stone, Chinatown. If you're a new immigrant, a small family, you can own a small storefront, or you can afford a rent in a small, you don't need a giant big box store rent to have a small thing that you can start, you know, a kind of family run business. So that to me, to have a place where that's possible, that is a value of Chinatown. And you know, and William Liu and Cam Y Dim Sum, who's in the film, that they are arguably like the biggest success story to come out of COVID in that Chinatown. And what is their model? It's like affordable food for the people of this neighborhood. And they are like a business success over and over. Why? Because they're actually serving the residents that are around them through this model and giving stability. Like being a steward is like anchoring the community down. So often, you know, you just think, oh, it's like a family restaurant. Yeah, it's a family restaurant, but the thing is like anchoring the community there. There's a meaning, it's a gathering spot for the community, and it's a place that like people who maybe can't afford some fancy dinner downtown can actually buy food there. So like, you know, the film was trying to attempt to show these shops in and of themselves, but also how important those things are to these like this like circular economy and very fragile ecosystem of what is like the Chinatown.
Yeah, for sure. So it's just like stewardship in many different ways. Yeah.
Like I like what you said about the idea of the ecosystem, because like, you know, it comes back to this idea of like, why do they exist? Why do Chinatowns exist? And it's very much to, you know, to think about the histories and why, like, you know, to have access to affordable food, to have access to culturally competent businesses, to be able to do your things in the language that you are most comfortable or can only speak. So I do think there's something really important to remember about that. And then to, you know, in the work that we do, coming back to this idea of like the value set, it's like, why are we here? Like, why do we need to protect Chinatown? And for what reason do Chinatowns need to exist? Like, you know, like, let's forget about the fact that it like brings economic value to the city. Let's like think about like, you know, when people come and they don't, you know, even if they're not from like a Chinese community, like people come to Chinatown because they can find work. And we see that also in Toronto, Chinatown too. Like people who are coming here, you know, can find work in Chinatown. They can find housing, they can find food. But that said, it's like, I think there are a lot of injustices and exploitations of these people because of that, right? Like, so it is this education. I do think it's like, we need to have different voices at the table. We need to like, as a community, be in conversation and to unpack what it means to be here and like why we choose to exist and why we choose to be in community with each other. And that's like, I think, a really important conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Something that I thought was interesting that both of you mentioned was like this idea of, you know, people who are not necessarily Chinese, like being in Chinatowns. And it just kind of occurred to me that like, well, in the context I'm most familiar with, like Toronto's first Chinatown, like it wasn't just a Chinatown. Like I think before it was Chinatown, or like, you know, at the same time it was Chinatown, it was like a lot of like Black Torontonians lived there, like Italians, and like, yeah, I guess I just think that's really interesting that I guess a lot of what makes Chinatowns like just this sanctuary, it that was needed for other communities too. And I guess I was just thinking about now how like a lot of the a lot of the pressures that we've been speaking about that affect Chinatowns, like land speculation, development, are really affecting like other communities of color. So like in Toronto, like Parkdale, in Montreal, like Park X, and, you know, other neighborhoods like across the city. So I guess I was just wondering how, maybe for both of you, like how you connect those struggles, and if that's like a conversation that you're having. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a conversation we're having. Like to me, Chinatown is, you know, it's kind of like a placemaker, or it's a placeholder for other communities that were wiped off the map, right? Like I mean, the film goes into the kind of racism of like laying down freeways, like in North America. You know, these things that kind of dissected our Chinatowns and ripped them apart. But very often, like the highway itself was the Black community. Like it's just gone.
Yeah, like
right?
Little Burgundy and
Little Burgundy had a highway run through it, and Hogan's Alley was destroyed in Vancouver. Even though they stopped the freeway, you know, Hogan's Alley was like, you know, erased. So I think so we could. There's so many lessons that the Chinatown struggle can bring to other communities, but also Chinatowns are often like the only ethnic enclave or neighborhood left, like geographically in the city when these other places have been displaced. So it's really an actual physical place where you can imagine or start thinking about, like you were talking about reconciliation, land back, like when you're building the future, like Chinatown actually still exists. So if you're going to try to model something of an inclusive future where you're thinking about decolonization, or you're thinking about these other things, you could actually execute that in Chinatown, like with this, like a new project or a new building. Like, how do we make that inclusive? And if you can get it to work in Chinatown, like maybe we can bring this to other places, right? So for sure, like we're talking, or we want to be talking with, and are talking with Little Burgundy, like other communities that have had similar pressures on them, and how do we connect, how do we work together? But also today, to know that in our Chinatown, it continues to have very vulnerable populations, all the Chinatowns. Like there's issues with houselessness, that there are other marginalized groups, you know, whether it be because of mental health issues, drug addiction issues, all of that. So the solutions we are making for our Chinatowns can't just be like push everybody outside the Chinatown gate and then it's like they don't exist anymore. These people are part of the Chinatown, like especially it's very visual and evident, like in Vancouver's Chinatown is part of the downtown east side. Like they are the same neighborhood, they overlap and they intermix. So the solution you're making for Chinatown cannot be let's just push everyone out and then it's like Chinatown's good. Like no, that's not the value system of Chinatown. It is a place that's sanctuary, and the solutions we find, even for like safety issues in Chinatown, need to be more holistic, right? and we can't just be, when you're blaming the victim for the problem, you realize like you have the wrong solution when the victims become the problem. So it's really, and this is where a lot of the tensions exist, right? But it's finding those larger solutions that help all the residents and not just a certain set or a certain class of residents within the Chinatown.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like because people who are like, they're our neighbors too, so yeah, they need to be integrated into that.
Yeah, I do think that like our fight is one drop in the bucket, and it's one part of a larger microcosm that's happening all across cities all over North America. And I do think that, you know, we have so much to learn from others who are also doing this fight, and we also have a lot to do in terms of showing up and being in solidarity. So it's like, whether that is sharing knowledge, sharing resources, showing up for other people's, like, you know, protests or rallies, like, I think that's the only way. And then I think a good example of that is through the land trust work. We're learning a lot from the other land trusts across the city. You know, we're constantly in conversation with Parkdale, with Little Jamaica, and even just sharing knowledge. And like in all those contexts, like the reason why land trusts need to exist are different, but it's like we're still the big picture of why we are existing is the same, right? Like, you know, being, you know, gentrification, being pushed out, lack of affordable housing, all of that. So I do think that like it's such a complex issue. Even if we think about, you know, the issues within Chinatown, they're so interrelated: health, food, living. Like, we can't forget that that extends to the rest of the city and broader too, right? So I think that like ultimately, like, if we are not in solidarity with other communities, it won't work. It won't work. Like, Chinatown is just a container of all the things that we need to do and all the things that are wrong. Yeah. That are, you know, challenging our societies today, like the complex problems that we're dealing with, right? So
yeah, for sure. I love that idea of Chinatown both as like a microcosm and potentially like a blueprint for the urban future. So I have one last question before we just take a break. So we've been talking a lot about, I think, the similarities between Chinatowns, but you both said like they're all so different. So I just wanted to ask like what memories of, you know, Chinatowns that you have kind of respective connections to, like what memories do you hold of those? And I guess what makes them special for you? I guess for you it would be Montreal, for you Toronto, or another Chinatown maybe. So
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have a similar answer that I'm going to give you. It's like, to me, what was so special about Chinatown is growing up there and visiting Chinatown with my grandmother, right? Like, my grandmother was born in Montreal's Chinatown, and when you would go to Chinatown with her, it's like you had the secret key, you know, to unlock all the secret places. So she knew everyone, you know, and they're speaking Toisanese, and it's like, hey, how are you? You know, and come up here, we'd drop groceries off to bachelor uncles and the rooming houses, and we'd go to the bakery, and they you know, they knew her by name, and it was like this, you know, crazy line outside the ho-hos where we are, Nanking. So I would get, as a child, my grandmother like put like $5 in my hand, and I would sneak under everyone in this crazy line, go to the counter, and she'd yell over to the guys who would know they had like cigarettes handing out there and paper hats, and they'd just dump all these pastries in these boxes, and I would kind of carry it out. But it's that magical, like the sense of community. I didn't even, like, linguistically, I had no idea what's going on, but you just, like, this warm place. And it was this place that my grandmother, who was always like kind of nervous to move around anywhere, anytime we're going down to Chinatown, she's there, you know, and she's like the queen of the place. And so it's that sense of community, but going into those spaces, and that's where I wanted the film really to go into those, the magical places behind the tourist facade, you know, behind the kind of storefront, into the place where like the soul of the community really is. Yeah. And then I found through doing this film, but also through like community organizing and all of that, like the past, because my grandmother passed away very shortly after I did my first film. So she passed away like in 2005. And in these past couple of years, like being like I feel like I found that community again, you know, like working with everyone. And then so now I'll go to the Chinatown, and it's like, hey, Peter Lee, Jimmy Chan, like, how are you guys, you know? And just yesterday we were in New York, or 2 days ago, with the film crew, And we went and visited all the subjects who were in the film before the film. So we ate at Hop Key with Peter Lee, and then we went to see Ken Lee and his family at KK Discount, and we visited Wing On Wo, and we were just welcomed in. And that's the thing about Chinatown. It's like, even I come here to Toronto, and it's like the folks at Hong Luk, the Kung Fu Club. It's just like, you know, where there's like, oh, come in, you know, and we're just, it's like you're just part of the family already. And when you go to the different Chinatown, it's like that. If you have like your one friend, it's almost like being, you know, you remember the Chans or the Wongs or the Lees. You find community. And I think for so many of us, and it was Hanya Tang, who's actually here in Toronto, she said this to me, and it stuck with me so hard. She said, you know, I don't necessarily relate to China, but I relate to Chinatown, right? For so many of us who are Chinese Canadian, it's like your ancestral village, the Chinatown. So to me, that it's like that sense of community and belonging is like what I hold so dear to Chinatown. Yeah.
I was gonna say, like, my story is really similar. Exactly what you're saying. Like, for me, I was born in this Chinatown, the Toronto West Chinatown, and my family, you know, like my parents were born in Vietnam, so we are part of the Chinese Vietnamese diaspora that left after the war in Vietnam, and my mom's side, like, all came and gathered themselves in Toronto. We, at one point, all of us lived in this one high rise in Chinatown. And I do think it was like a safety net. It was like a place that they called home for a while, where they tried to find their legs. And similarly too, like when I was growing up, my grandma would take us, like, she knew everyone, you know, she volunteered in Chinatown for like until she wasn't able to, you know, and like I never really like thought about what that meant. It just felt so natural. But then when you leave, like, you are just kind of, you realize that you don't have that same relationship with other places, you know, and I think that when you reflect on that, you're like, there's something really important about this place, and there's something that needs to be maintained and protected. And so yeah, I think that's a very similar story that I think many folks will have. To be able to know that you can come here and get the foods that you need, to know that you'll know people and you know their stories and you can say hi to them. Yeah. There is something super, like, just wonderful about that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think like for so many parts of the city, like, it's so like individualistic and like atomized, and you don't have that. So it's so special to kind of to have that in a Chinatown, and also to hear your memories of that. So thank you so much for sharing. I think we're going to take a little bit of a break before we get start eating those rice noodle rolls. So yeah. Spilling rice rolls on yourself. Yeah.
Like later when you see this giant soy sauce stain, I know where it came from.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, great. So we're back with Alex Hong from Friends of Chinatown Toronto, and Chinatown Community Land Trust, and Karen Cho, the director of Big Fight in Little Chinatown. We are back with rice noodle rolls, which are kind of messy to eat on camera, but we're doing it anyway. And so we just have some like quick fire fun questions for you to just like kind of get to know you better. So my first one is, if you could only choose one carb to eat, from rice, noodles, bread, or potatoes, which do you choose and why?
Rice. I don't even, there's no other choice. Like, I don't know. Maybe rice, hands down rice.
I'm also going to say rice, but the reason is because it also can be noodles.
So true.
So, and you can also use it to make other things. So I feel like it's a very versatile.
Yeah, you can make soup.
Yeah.
Congee. Yeah.
Rice flour, then you can, you know, emulate the other carbs.
Rice is like the carb. Yeah. Okay, good. I have actually chosen noodles in this because we ask this question a lot here at Real Asian, and it's always between rice and noodles for me. So if it's like, I think which one do I like better? Like, noodles have like a slightly elevated role above rice, just because I think they're fun to slurp. But if it was like one carb for the rest of my life, like rice hands down because of the reasons that you said. Okay, and so my next quick fire question is, what is your like favorite or funniest or like funnest memory in Chinatown? In a Chinatown, any Chinatown.
Funnest is like very like.
I'll let you go first.
I have to go first. The funnest or I think I don't know, like I feel like this is just like it kind of goes back to like I guess the thing we said earlier. Just being able to spend Chinatown with my like grandma was a really big memory for me, and I think that for me now going back to the same shops, I would say like that would be like a really important memory for me.
Yeah, I think it's hard to funny. I mean, the funniest thing that just happened recently. This is kind of fun. So I mentioned like we took our film crew in New York, to the New York Chinatown to visit all the subjects and stuff. So the editor of the film, his name is Ryan Mullen. So he came to Chinatown. So he's been living like virtually in all these Chinatowns for the past, year, like he's seen hours and hours of footage of all so he knows the spaces intimately, but he's never been there. So I took him down to Chinatown 2 days ago. We took him to KK Discount, and KK, if you watch the film, it's the opening of the film. This store opens, it has like it's a quintessential store, and the owners are so nice, and we filmed inside and all that as well. So we went and we visited with Ken Lee, the owner, and I hadn't been there. I mean, I feel like I've been there because I've been in the edit room, but we hadn't been there for like since last July. So I'm like, Ken, how are you? It's so good to see you, because there was also a fire in that building after we filmed, and that business been shut down until 2 weeks ago, and it's like a beloved Chinatown business. So they finally opened. Anyways, I'm like, Ken, how are you? Do you remember? Like, we were filming with you last summer. He's like, oh yeah, I remember you. And then I was standing with Ryan. He's like, yeah, I remember you too. And Ryan's never been there. It's because he's a white guy, and he kind of has like similar hair or similar hair color to my DP who was there when we were shooting. My DP Nate, and I thought it was so funny. I'm like, yes, all white guys look the same. So
that is really.
But I mean, we all had like COVID, met like it's hard to recognize everybody. But I just thought that was like a funny moment. And I think now for me, especially like like being there with your grandmother, is how much my son has connected with Chinatown. Because for the past, he's 8 now, but since he's been 5, I'm like ranting and raving all over the house, and I'm about Chinatown, talking about Chinatown, all this stuff, and bringing him down to Chinatown for all of these kind of organizing efforts we're doing, and kind of bribing him with like Pokemon cards and stuff to like join for some of these things. But we in with the Chinatown working group last summer, I think it was, we were doing a kind of helping. They had this crazy OCPM. Anyways, the city had this like consultation because we fought to get certain parts of the Chinatown like down zone because the speculation, and then of course your thing about like language. So then of course it's Quebec. So they do an entire consultation on Chinatown in French, only in French. Like they would, if you ask, they'll translate certain things in English, and this is for the residents who live there, like to know their future. So nothing was in Chinese. Of course, like it doesn't even, and whatever. So it was just crazy. So we took their flyer, we translated it into Chinese, simplified and traditional Chinese, and we needed to flyer the neighborhood. And my son, he was 7, he comes down and was like 40. It was like this crazy hot day with us when we went to all the senior citizens home, and he was just so proud to go around, and he fly. I mean, I bribed him with the Pokemon cards, but he went and he like every single shop and business, because he loves all the Chinatown stores. Like he would go, and when you're an adult handing out paper, people are like, no, I don't want to buy it, I don't care, but you send your child, it's amazing. Everybody's oh yes, I want this paper. It really worked out well. But I was so proud that he loves the community. Like I'm trying to pass on that that feeling, that special feeling that my grandmother gave to me, to my son. So he flyered the whole Chinatown. I'm like, you see the older folk, you say Josan, you're gonna like that. It's gonna make them feel, so he's Josan. It's like hanging. It was really good.
Oh
that was special.
That is very cute. Oh, and I'm so glad that your son gets to like have that community too. Okay, my next quick fire question is just like, if you have any shout outs to like any organizations that you've been working with, or like people even who like worked on the film, or just anyone you want to shout out, just go for it.
Oh my lord. Okay, I'll let you go
Okay,
first.
I'm like, I'm ready for this. I think that obviously, FOCT works oftentimes in collaboration with other organizations. So I think right now I want to shout out Butterfly, which does a lot of work supporting migrant and sex workers within Chinatown. Workers Action Center, which is a big organization supporting workers' rights and just really just thinking about it from a larger perspective, on a national perspective as well. I think that like within FOCT ourselves, we are a pretty amorphous group of people. And I think like we, I think just shouting out the folks in FOCT, who also organize with me and whose knowledge I'm bringing to the table here today.
Yeah, awesome.
Oh my god, like I could literally talk for the next 10 minutes. All the people that need
Just
to
like
be,
list your
called out. Like they are hopefully in the credits.
Yeah.
But I mean, locally we're here in Toronto, so I'd love to call out like the Long Time No See Collective, Hong Luk, Kung Fu Club, friends at Chinatown Toronto who helped me so much at the beginning. We were at this Coast to Coast Chinatowns Against Displacement. That's another shout out conference. But Wing on Woe, the WOW Project. And in Montreal, of course, where I am, there was the Chinatown Working Group, but there's also the Jia Foundation now, like a kind of nonprofit that we've for storytelling and placemaking in our Chinatown that we founded out in Vancouver. There's Youth Collaborative for Chinatown, the Wong Family Association, Han Sing, all scenes of the film, the Shiba, which is the Chinatown Society Heritage Buildings Association. There are so many people that help to be these kind of stewards of Chinatown, working to protect the Chinatown. So, and then there is a ton of other people that I have not shouted out, but I'm thinking of you, and you're in the credits of the film. But yeah, no, there's so many people working together for the Chinatowns. Yeah,
and I think that just speaks to how much of a collective effort like your film was. So it's really beautiful. And okay, so my last thing is just like, what's next, like film wise, for Friends of Chinatown, you personally, what's next?
Well, for the film next, what I'm really excited about, I mean, we're in a festival stage now. It's going to be the Canadian premiere. It was the world premiere before, and then we're going to do a Quebec premiere. But after the kind of festival run, we're working with the producers. We really want to do an impact campaign with the film. So that means like bringing the film out. Like we want to work with different community groups to show the film, screen the film in the different Chinatowns, and have the different communities like use the film as a tool for their organizing, a discussion point, maybe do co-fundraisers or something. But we really want to do a kind of impact campaign in North America. I mean, we're looking for an American sale for the film as well, but we want the film to have, well, that's why you make the film. You don't just make a film, people watch it, then they go home. It's like there's a story here and a need here, and the community like gifted me these stories and their time and all of this. So now the film is done. It's like we gift the film back to the community. It's their story to take and to tell. So that's something I'm really excited about. Like this kind of, hopefully for the next year or so, like we'll be trying to organize these community screenings and working with groups to do that. And then in Montreal's Chinatown, I was mentioning we founded recently a nonprofit organization called the Jia Foundation, and Jia is Mandarin word for like home, like this idea of like your place where you belong. But it's a nonprofit that's concerned with like storytelling and place making or place keeping in the Chinatown, because in our Chinatown, the narrative, the history of our Chinatown was getting erased by these new condo projects would come in, literally erase the Chinatown gate that they were building right beside of, and pretend they're moving into some fancy downtown Chinatown, downtown Montreal place that's near the Quartier de Spectacle and near the old port and right downtown, this luxury place. I'm like, yeah, that place is called Chinatown. So it was, our story was literally getting erased. So this idea of telling your story within the context of the history of the neighborhood, but also reactivating those spaces, and so that's what Jia is working to do. So I'm really excited to be kind of working more with them, and also there's like so many things that are on the cutting room floor. So to to use some of that content and that knowledge that we have, you know, to produce more things for the place keeping of the neighborhood.
Yeah. I think I actually saw some of maybe your work when I was in Montreal. Like there were like placards or like
That's Parker Ma. He had an exhibit up, but he's with us in the Jia Foundation. Cool. Yeah, no, but it's exactly those kind of ideas, those stories like in the place that we're trying to do. Yeah.
They're awesome. Yeah. Alex, like what's next for FOCT? What's next for you?
For FOCT, we are working on our land trust is really new, so we actually are not incorporated yet. So we're on path to do that. So hopefully in the new year that will happen, and then we are continuing our organizing work, you know, like wherever the fight takes us, I guess.
Amazing. Well, yeah, I think that's all the time we have for today. Just thank you both so much for being a part of Backstory. And I'm Vidhya Elango, and we have Joseph Chung live mixing. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Backstory podcast from the Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival. Please like and subscribe and give us a 5-star review on your favorite platform. You can watch these episodes on Real Asian's YouTube channel too. And we love hearing from you, so write to us at backstory@realasian.com. For more information about Friends of Chinatown and their Land Trust fundraising, visit them at Friends of Chinatown TO. For more information about us, we're at Real Asian, or go to realasian.com.